The summer air was thick, pressing against the walls of my small apartment like an invisible weight. The ceiling fan above me whirred lazily, doing little to push away the lingering heat. The blinds were half-drawn, casting slanted lines of golden sunlight across the wooden floor. It was late afternoon, the kind of time where the world feels caught between the urgency of the day and the slow descent into night. I sat on the edge of my bed, running a towel through my damp hair. The shower had done little to cool me off, but at least the beads of sweat were replaced with droplets of water. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak from the wooden beams above me. Jack was supposed to be here by now. Jack, my best friend, my straight best friend. We had been close since college, though lately, something between us felt different, like an unspoken shift neither of us was willing to address. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me sometimes, his eyes lingering a little too long before flickering away. Or maybe it was the way my heart beat just a little too fast whenever he was near. I glanced at my phone. 4:37 p.m. He was late. A soft creak came from the hallway outside my apartment. I turned my head, waiting, but there was nothing, just silence. I swallowed, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably nothing. I stood up, dropping the towel onto my bed, stretching my arms over my head. The air conditioning in my building had been on the fritz for weeks, and the heat pressed against my skin, making my every movement feel sluggish. Just as I reached for a fresh t-shirt, the sound of the front door unlocking sent a jolt of surprise through me. I froze. I had forgotten to lock it. And then, before I could grab anything to cover myself, Jack stepped inside. His eyes met mine. His gaze dropped for a second, taking in more than he should have. And then, for a moment, time slowed. My breath caught in my throat. The heat in the apartment was suddenly nothing compared to the fire rushing beneath my skin. Jack stood in the doorway, the late afternoon light spilling in behind him, casting a soft glow around his tall frame. His gaze had dropped before snapping back up, and I couldn't tell if he had really seen everything or if his mind was still catching up to what was in front of him. "Shit," Jack exhaled, his voice sharp but low. He turned his head fast, his hand gripping the doorknob. I moved quicker than I thought possible, yanking the towel off the bed and wrapping it around my waist. My pulse hammered in my ears. "You're early," I managed, my voice hoarse. Jack's back was still half turned to me, but his shoulders were tense. His fingers flexed on the doorknob, like he was debating whether to leave altogether. "Yeah, sorry." His voice was rougher now, like he had swallowed something too big to get down. You didn't answer, so I figured." I cleared my throat, clutching the towel tighter. "Figured you'd just walk in." Jack huffed out something between a laugh and a scoff. "You usually leave the door open." He wasn't wrong. Jack had always come and gone from my place, like it was his own, and I never thought twice about it. But now, with the weight of his eyes still lingering on me, even if he wasn't looking directly, I felt stripped bare in more ways than one. "I thought you were going to be later," I muttered, trying to ease the tension. Jack finally turned back, though he kept his eyes fixed very carefully on my face, as if looking anywhere else might be dangerous. "Yeah, finished work early." I nodded, swallowing hard. The air between us felt different, charged in a way it hadn't before. I'd been shirtless around him plenty of times. Hell, we'd gone swimming together, changed in the same locker rooms. But this was different. This was intimate in a way I wasn't ready for. I turned away, gripping the dresser for balance. My heart wouldn't slow. Jack cleared his throat. "You, want to get dressed?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Yeah, probably a good idea." I moved toward the closet, feeling Jack shift awkwardly behind me. The room felt too small. Every second felt like it stretched into something heavier. I reached for a pair of boxers and sweatpants, sliding them on quickly before grabbing a shirt. Jack had stepped fully inside now, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure where to stand. When I turned around, he was watching me. It was subtle, so subtle that if I hadn't spent years learning the micro-expressions of his face, I wouldn't have caught it. His gaze flickered downward for just a fraction of a second before snapping back up, like a reflex. My stomach twisted. I forced a smirk. "Didn't know you were so eager to see me naked, man." Jack barked out a laugh, but there was something off about it. Something forced. He shook his head, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Shut up," he muttered. "Not my fault you were just standing there. Not my fault you walked in unannounced." Jack rolled his eyes but didn't push back further. Instead, he moved toward the couch, flopping down like he was trying too hard to be casual. His leg bounced, an old nervous habit. "So, what were we doing today?" he asked, voice too light. "Movie? Food? Or just standing around in towels all day?" I let out a chuckle, but my chest still felt tight. Something was off. I sat down on the other end of the couch, trying to push away the lingering tension. But the silence between us wasn't normal. It wasn't the easy quiet we usually had. It was thick, loaded. Jack shifted, glancing at me before looking away again. So... He hesitated, and that's when I knew. I'd known Jack for years, and I had never seen him hesitate like this. A strange feeling crept up my spine, hope mixed with fear. Finally, he exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Look, it's not a big deal, all right." I frowned. "What's not?" He gestured vaguely toward me. "That..." I blinked, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Me being naked? You sure? You're acting like you saw a ghost." Jack's jaw tightened. I said it's not a big deal, but his leg was still bouncing. My stomach twisted again, but this time it wasn't just nerves. It was something heavier, something real. I licked my lips, my voice quieter now. "Then why do you look like you're about to have a panic attack?" Jack stilled. His legs stopped bouncing. His fingers flexed in his lap. Something passed between us. Something unsaid, something dangerous. And then his phone rang. Jack jolted. Like the sound had snapped him out of whatever thoughts had been gripping him. He fumbled for it, barely glancing at the screen before standing abruptly. "Gotta take this," he muttered, already moving toward the door. I watched him go, my pulse still hammering. The door shut behind him, and I was left alone in the thick, suffocating silence. The room felt different now. It wasn't just the heat. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment. Something had shifted, something I wasn't sure we could come back from. The silence in my apartment stretched long after Jack left, thick and suffocating, like a wool blanket over my skin. I could still hear the lingering echo of the door clicking shut, but it wasn't enough to shake the strange energy he had left behind. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. I should have laughed it off, should have let it go. It wasn't the first time Jack had walked in at the wrong moment. He was my best friend. Things like this weren't supposed to matter, but they did. I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes lingered, the way his leg bounced, the way he left too quickly, his voice too tight, his hands too restless. I stood, pacing to the window, trying to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, staining the sky in streaks of pink and deep orange. It should have felt like any other evening, but something was off. My phone buzzed on the counter. "Jack, still up?" I hesitated before replying. "Me? Yeah. You coming back?" A long pause. Then, "Jack!" "Yeah. Be there in 10. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the phone. He had left in a hurry, but now he was coming back. I didn't know what to expect, but my chest felt tight, anticipation buzzing beneath my skin. When the knock finally came, I moved fast, unlocking the door and pulling it open. Jack stood there, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. He looked different now, tense, like he was holding something back. I stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was darker now, the only light coming from the glow of the street lamps outside. Jack moved past me, pausing for a second like he was deciding something before finally sitting down on the couch. I closed the door. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I walked over, sitting next to him, but not too close. There was space between us, but it wasn't comfortable. It was loaded. Jack exhaled, rubbing his jaw. I freaked out earlier. I swallowed, keeping my voice even. Yeah, I noticed. A dry chuckle escaped him, but there was no humor in it. He stared at his hands for a moment, then at me. Something in his eyes made my breath catch. I wasn't expecting. He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know. The air between us shifted again. Jack had always been the one who filled silence, who cracked jokes, who never let things get too serious. But now, he just sat there, staring, looking like he was about to say something he shouldn't. I forced a smirk, trying to ease whatever was hanging between us. If this is about seeing me naked, man, I promise you'll survive. You've seen worse at the gym. Jack's jaw clenched. It's not about that. The room felt smaller. The space between us wasn't enough. He looked at me again, and this time it was different. I should have looked away, should have said something to break the moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. Jack swallowed, his throat working. His fingers flexed on his knee, like he was holding something back. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. His voice was quiet, but the weight in it was undeniable. My stomach flipped. He wasn't talking about walking in on me. He was talking about everything. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My chest felt tight, my skin hot despite the cool night air slipping in through the open window. Jack exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he was frustrated with himself. I don't know what the hell's wrong with me. I felt something crack inside me. Nothing's wrong with you. He let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because it sure as hell feels like it. My pulse pounded so loud, I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that Jack was right here, right in front of me, looking at me like he never had before. Like he wanted something he wasn't supposed to want. The space between us disappeared before I even realized I was leaning in. It was barely a shift, just a breath of movement, but Jack noticed. His lips parted slightly, his breath uneven. His fingers twitched on his knee, like he was fighting something, like he was fighting himself. I swore I saw it. The moment his resolve cracked, the moment he almost closed the distance. And then he jerked back. The air between us snapped, like a rubber band pulled too tight and suddenly released. Jack shot up from the couch, running a hand through his hair. His breathing was uneven, his expression unreadable. I gotta go. The words hit harder than I expected. I stayed seated, my body still buzzing, my thoughts a tangled mess. Jack was already at the door, gripping the handle like it was the only thing keeping him upright. I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice raw. And then he was gone. The door shut behind him. I sat there in the heavy, suffocating silence, staring at the empty space where he had just been. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if he was coming back. The room felt hollow without him. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something, a knock, a message, anything. But the silence stretched on, pressing in around me like thick smoke. My heart was still racing, my skin still buzzing, and the air in the apartment felt charged with something unfinished. Jack had left too fast, like he was running, like if he stayed even a second longer, something would have happened. I rubbed my hands over my face, exhaling slowly. This wasn't nothing. I wasn't crazy. I felt it. That pull between us, that flicker of something dangerous. The way he looked at me, the way he almost leaned in. I reached for my phone, fingers hovering over his name in my messages. I should say something, ask if he was okay, pretend like we could smooth this over, like tonight hadn't just rewritten the entire foundation of our friendship. What was I even supposed to say? Me, you good? I stared at the message for a long time before finally pressing send. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then nothing. I cursed under my breath, tossing my phone onto the couch and pacing toward the window. The city hummed outside, indifferent to whatever was unraveling inside of me. The night air was cooler now, slipping in through the half-open window, but it did nothing to put out the fire still burning in my chest. Jack wasn't answering, and that silence said more than anything he could have texted. The next day, I heard nothing. I told myself not to check my phone every 5 minutes, but it didn't stop me from doing it anyway. Jack wasn't the type to ghost me. Not like this. Not when something was wrong. By the time evening rolled around, my frustration had swallowed my hesitation. I wasn't going to sit here waiting for him to decide whether or not he wanted to acknowledge what happened. I grabbed my keys and headed to his place. The drive felt longer than usual, my fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly. I tried to rehearse what I was going to say, but every version of the conversation felt useless. Jack didn't like being pushed, but he also didn't run from me, not until now. When I pulled into his apartment complex, his car was there. Good. He couldn't avoid this. I walked up to his door, taking a slow breath before knocking. There was a long pause. Then, finally, the sound of footsteps. The door cracked open. Jack stood there, hoodie pulled up over his head, his expression unreadable. He didn't move to let me in. "Hey," I said, voice careful. His eyes flickered to mine, then away. "Hey." The tension was immediate. It pressed between us, thick and suffocating, a ghost of last night hanging in the air. "You weren't answering my texts," I said. Jack exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his face. "I know." That was it. No excuse. No explanation. I clenched my jaw, frustration creeping into my voice. "Are you going to tell me what the hell is going on? Or am I supposed to pretend like last night didn't happen?" Jack's entire body stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." I huffed out a humorless laugh. "Bullshit." His grip on the doorknob tightened, knuckles turning white. "I don't." "You do." I stepped forward, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Jack, you felt that. Don't stand here and act like you didn't." His jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. That was the worst part. Not denial, not anger, just silence. I swallowed hard, my voice quieter now. "Why'd you run?" Jack exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Because I had to." Something in his voice cracked on the last word. Barely noticeable, but I caught it. He wasn't just avoiding me. He was avoiding himself. I took a slow step back, my chest tightening. "Okay." Jack's brows furrowed. "Okay." I nodded once. "I'm not going to force you to talk about something you're not ready for." My voice was steady, but my stomach twisted with every word. "But I'm also not going to sit around and pretend like this never happened." His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. I turned, my pulse hammering as I started walking away. I made it 3 steps before I heard his voice, low and rough behind me. "I don't know what to do with this." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be around you right now." His words landed like a punch to the gut. I closed my eyes for a second before inhaling deeply. "You don't have to have it figured out, Jack," I said quietly. "But don't shut me out." The silence that followed felt like it stretched forever. Then, finally, "I'll try." It wasn't much, but it was something. Days passed. Jack didn't text and I didn't reach out. I told myself to wait, to give him space, to let him figure out whatever storm was raging in his head. But patience had never been my strong suit, and every minute that ticked by without a word from him felt heavier, more unbearable. Had I pushed too hard? Or worse, had I not pushed hard enough? It wasn't like we hadn't been through fights before. Jack and I had known each other for years. We had seen each other through breakups, through family drama, through the kind of messy, real-life shit that should have been harder to come back from than this. But this wasn't like any of those things. This was something neither of us had a script for. I replayed that moment at his door over and over in my head. The way his voice had cracked, the way his fingers tightened on the doorknob, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I don't know how to be around you right now. I didn't know how to be around him either. And maybe that was the worst part. By the time Friday night rolled around, I had convinced myself that I wouldn't hear from him. I had tried to let it go, tried to accept that some things don't have clean resolutions, that some things just end. Then my phone buzzed. "Jack, are you home?" My heart slammed against my ribs. "Me? Yeah." Another long pause. Then, "Jack, I'm outside." I sucked in a sharp breath. My pulse was a steady, frantic drumbeat as I crossed the room, unlocking the door and pulling it open. Jack stood there, hands in his pockets, hood up. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were shadowed, his shoulders tense like he was preparing for a fight he wasn't sure he wanted to have. The sight of him sent a rush of relief through me, but it was mixed with something else. Something heavier, something unspoken. We stood there, staring at each other, neither of us saying a word. Then, "I can't stop thinking about it," Jack admitted, voice barely above a whisper. The air between us snapped tight. I felt it again, that same pull, that same unsteady, terrifying, undeniable gravity that had been there that night in my apartment. Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, his jaw clenching. "I don't—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I don't know what this means. I don't know what the hell is wrong with me." I took a slow step forward, my chest tight. "Nothing's wrong with you, Jack." His eyes flickered to mine, uncertain, searching, like he wanted to believe me but didn't know how. Another breath, a heartbeat of silence, and then Jack took a step closer. Not much, barely anything, but enough to change everything.